Hello, fellow historiography students. I'm Eric Morningstar, and welcome to week number 2 of the works of W.E.B. Du Bois. Last week we had Black Reconstruction in America, and this week we are tackling Dusk of Dawn, published in 1940. And this is Du Bois's autobiographical work. As always, we'll be talking about the argument of the book, its structure, and as always, delving into some critiques of the work and connecting it to Hegelian dialectics. So, I do want to, at the beginning of this video, kind of give a disclaimer about how I am reading this book. Now, in reading this book, it reminded me of others that we've covered. One being Cheese and the Worms, and also A Good Woman, or A Landscape for a Good Woman, by Steedman. And I was wondering why I was thinking of these books. Well, they're closest, to autobiographical format. This, of course, is more of a biography, laced with ideology and commentary on history, and Steedman's does that as well, although that is from first person. Not surprisingly, I really enjoyed this book, as you all know. This book I didn't really have a strong feeling about, but probably leaning towards negative. And this book, I also have some pretty serious problems with, but not like necessarily the content of the book. It has to do with the autobiographical format. And I will explain why right now. The reason is that anytime someone's attempting to write about their life, ultimately it's still being written at time B, not time A. So everything that we are getting from this book is really coming through years of mental filter, all kinds of psychological processes, reevaluation, repression. And so in some of this, Du Bois even acknowledges, but there are other things that I have to read this as this is the voice, even though he's talking about the past, this is Du Bois's voice at the time of writing. So I don't really look at it as an intent, like I don't read autobiographies as if they are actually recapturing what they're talking about recapturing. It's more of a personal commentary on one's own past, without ever actually revealing what the past was truly like entirely. Certainly there are echoes, but not completely. Justification for this, I mean, I always point out the research of Elizabeth Loftus on memory, connected to eyewitness testimony. People have a hard time remembering what happened minutes to hours ago, let alone years. So if you're not familiar with that, I mean, Google the Oracle will tell you. So, but getting to the argument of this book, we read in the Apology, we're still in Roman numerals here, but on 33, he says, I have written then what is meant to be not so much my autobiography as the autobiography of a concept of race, elucidated, magnified, and doubtless distorted in the thoughts and deeds which were mine. So he does mention the distortion there, but he doesn't really focus on it enough in the book, in my opinion. Then on page 3, he's commenting again on his purpose for writing this book. He says, finally, I could see the scientific task of the 20th century would be to explore and measure the scope of chance and unreason in human action, which does not yield to argument but changes slowly and with difficulty after long study and careful development. My intent in this book is to set forth the interaction of this stream and change of my thought on my work and in relation to what has been going on in the world since my birth. And then lastly, from 25 of the introduction to this book, and indeed one of the most extensive discussions that runs through Dusk of Dawn, is an exploration of why Du Bois had come to believe against the official position of the NAACP that it was crucial to develop separate and Black economic and social institutions in segregated America. But actually, it was the wrong quote that I just read to you that was supposed to come in later in the discussion. But that's just kind of giving the intellectual development at the end of Du Bois's life. We'll go ahead and start talking about structure then. Du Bois starts off this book talking about how he's growing up in Massachusetts. He's talking about his intellectual development in high school. He moves on to his university years, which leads him to Harvard, which carries on to his appointment at Atlanta University, his intellectual controversial disagreement with Booker T. Washington, and then really just his movement towards to developing things like the Niagara movement, his establishment of crisis, and then his separation from the NACP. Throughout all of this, the intellectual development here, beginning back when he was a young student, Du Bois comments that he really wanted to excel. He wasn't terribly favorable. Like, he didn't view favorably his fellow black students who didn't succeed as well as he did, as he put it, as besting the whites. For example, he mentions that on page 10, upon graduating high school, once during my course, another young dark man had attended the school for a short time, but I was very much ashamed of him because he did not excel the whites, as I was quite used to doing. Even the people that he lived with in his community growing up, he mentions that would sometimes look down upon other blacks. For example, he says on 5, we knew little of them, but felt above them because of our education and economic status. So I found this kind of information to be surprising. I wasn't expecting to read that. Again, one could put this as part, this is what he was thinking when he was growing up. I tend to, as I said, view this as we can only understand the words that he's using as from 1940 at the time of the writing. So, including this, I feel like he really wanted to emphasize these points. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to be better, even amongst his own black schoolfellows, and especially against his white schoolfellows. And this continued on to his university. He wanted to attend Harvard right out of the gate. He did not. He ended up going to Fisk University. Upon going there and graduating on 16, for example, he says, I was determined to make a scientific conquest of my environment, which would render the emancipation of the Negro race easier and quicker. So we kind of move then from Du Bois as a student into Du Bois as he goes to Harvard, where he meets intellectual luminaries like William James, who also discouraged him for pursuing philosophy as a career. He decided that, so what would be considered today, he says, sociology as his focus. And, that's exactly what Du Bois did, studying, for example, the African-American situation in Philadelphia, which was eventually published as the Philadelphia Negro. But, in doing that, hold on one second. Okay, sorry for the interruption there. But yes, so Du Bois then, as he's working and doing his sociological work, comes to a realization that, in choosing to do social science work really was a way for Du Bois to combat, at the time, what was, largely a scientific justification for the oppression of African Americans. He mentions having talked with or was associated with Benet, and we all know about Stanford Benet and other forms of intellectual assessment. All that stuff was extremely racially prejudiced and just put a bad spin on it. There was a lot of talk about the inferiority of races and how to justify it, just to try to hold on to the same Jim Crow laws that were limiting the agency of African Americans. So, but even in doing that work, really as a challenge to the status quo, he kind of came to a realization that this wasn't enough. He tells the story about a gentleman named Sam Hose, H-O-S-E, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but was arrested for murder, and he mentions on 34 that you can't really be a detached scientist looking at the problems that blacks faced when this case was going on. And what happened was he was going at the time, after reviewing the facts of the case, to meet with Joel Chandler Harris and the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. But of course, on the way to the meeting, with letter of introduction on him, he finds out that Hose was lynched and that his knuckles were on display near where he was walking. And he just turns around and leaves. It's like you can't actually be a passive scientist and attempt to kind of fix the problem in the long term or over the long term. Something needs to be done right now. Blacks need to be out there agitating, fighting for what it's just a right to live and to be treated humanely. So, and after that, he kind of goes into the intellectual controversy with Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, in as much as he fought for his own education, really wanted African Americans to pursue education and to have a voice for their ideas amongst the Black intelligentsia. And at the same time, Booker T. Washington's approach to fixing Black problems was really to focus not so much on entering the political arena or spreading of ideology, but to gain capital so that the next generation could attend college and be a voice for change. That might be a better way to approach the situation. Du Bois obviously disagrees, and that kind of led to him being on the outs of what he calls the Tuskegee machine. It's a university where Booker T. Washington was working to spread this kind of system. And Du Bois mentions that Booker T. Washington was this a great force, was wined and dined by people of influence, and it really just was literally turning out people who would go ahead and spread this ideology. And basically the way I took it was kind of putting African Americans on pause, as if to say that they didn't have worthwhile ideas at the time, which by virtue of history we know that they did, Du Bois being a solid example of that. And that's the kind of agency that he wanted. And this was carried out through saying, hey, listen, we have to have equal rights. We can't have these laws making it harder for us to vote, get an education, and to be successful, and it has to happen right now. And so, considering that, I do kind of want to move into critiques and other thoughts here because we're at 15 minutes. My biggest problem, I think, like I said, is with the format of this book. I think that there's something to be said for the position that Booker T. Washington had. I think that there's also something to say about Du Bois's critique of Booker T. Washington being the one to, by trying to start at a premise of a positive message about how we can fix these problems, instead, like, who are you to say what people should do? We have ideas right now. Of course, and then pushing everyone towards education as opposed to developing capital and achieving economic power. I think that he's kind of guilty of doing the same thing because he's the one telling people what they should do and what they should value. And all of that depends on the system of thought that's going to be taught in high schools, college. So while, yes, he very much values education, and often throughout the book, waxes romantic on European civility and kind of traditional cultured ways of thinking. He's very romantic in the way that he speaks at times when he's discussing, taking on the establishment. At one point, he says that he is tilting against, which is a throwback to jousting. So he's like, he sees himself as a knight, or somebody who's going to engage in jousting. The dedication to this book, is to scholar and knight. It's really interesting as to how that works. There's a certain elevation of particular types of ideology, which isn't going to be the same for everybody. But in essence, he's arguing for that. So, it's not necessarily to say that he's wrong. It's to say that I think in this format, it doesn't necessarily work. Where it did work by pointing out just the history, or at least, there's a certain level of detachment that makes it history in Black Reconstruction, despite the problems and sources. And, he mentions the problems and the sources that he had in working in sociology as well in this book. But, all that aside, this is rooted in his voice and the things that he values. And, and in essence, when he moves to really advocating for separate Black institutions, it's problematic for me and pushing people towards education and the criticisms that he places on capitalism. As he grows older, he's kind of realizing it's not really about race, it's about money and power. But in a way, I don't really see his motivation that he lists throughout his life to be anything but sort of capitalistic in nature. For example, when he's talking about, I had to go to Harvard because it was the best. He separates economic pursuits and intellectual pursuits, but really I don't see how they can really be separated. Yes, it's not wealth in terms of property or the way that we think about it, but he was thirsting because of his talent and his ability to succeed and cherish success over others. It's like the capitalistic zeal for intellectual prowess, let's say. So I critique him on that. That was not well said. I apologize. But I think it's valid. There is certainly a dominating, like a desire to dominate throughout this book. Even though he's talking about, years before, we have to take it as at the time of the writing. And when he's including, passages, when he's the chapter on, let's see, what was it called? The White World? Yeah, the White World. It's almost laid out like in a Socratic dialogue format, which in and of itself, just by writing in that format, is saying, okay, well, I'm going to teach you how to think. And there's a certain arrogance to it. But like he says things like, uh, in this discussion with his colleague here, black folk are much superior to white, possibly serious, probably not, but serious and soberly, we black folk are the salvation of mankind. That's it comes across as heavy. There is a certain, and justifiably so, but a certain kind of. I'm not even commenting on black versus white here. I'm talking about how there definitely is kind of a drive in Du Bois to be on top. So then to come back and tie it into a capitalistic model, you really got to separate between how do you define wealth and how do you define success? Which, let's go back to Novick and at 21 minutes here, let's just start talking about the dialectic. Everything in here, yes, this can be objectively true and right for Du Bois, but it doesn't necessarily make it right for anyone else. And inside of the book, you also have connections to dialectic between Booker T. Washington's position and Du Bois's own. Du Bois's position on the NAACP position here, his separation from that particular organization and the movement towards making things better for black folk, and I think that the world benefits so much from Du Bois's work, but I think that in terms of Dusk of Dawn, I don't think that this book in particular adds to his library, if anything. I think it's confusing. If it's a book about the race concept, this could be told through traditional history. It's not a proper autobiography either, because so much of Du Bois's life is left out. His wife gets one line in the entire book. I think that this book wanted or could have been something else, or that the body of work that Du Bois produced really can stand alone without it. So please forgive me for the disjointed nature of the video, but I think that it will be a worthwhile discussion. I hope that you got something out of this, and I will see you all tomorrow.